On a freezing morning deep over enemy-controlled Europe, a teenage American farm boy was expected to disappear with his aircraft. Instead, he would become proof that some Americans do not surrender, not to fear, not to physics, not even to the sky itself. At 11:32 on the morning of November 29, 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran knelt in the tail section of a B-7 flying fortress named wreckage, watching German fighters swarm toward his bomber like angry hornets. He was 19 years old, a farm boy from Wisconsin. This was his first combat mission, deep over hostile territory, against one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in Europe. That morning, the 8th Air Force had launched a vast bomber stream toward Bremen. On paper, the task appeared straightforward. Strike the factories that sustained the German war machine, then turn back toward England. In reality, it was a corridor built to extract a price from every mile. Even before Moran's aircraft reached the target area, bombers ahead of him were already gone, breaking formation and falling away into cloud and smoke. Moran's position was the loneliest on the aircraft. The tail gunner sat at the extreme rear, isolated by long stretches of aluminum fuselage from the rest of the crew. He could not see the pilot's hands on the controls. He could not see the navigator adjusting headings. He could barely hear voices once the engines settled into their relentless rhythm. His entire world narrowed to 2 machine guns, a small cone of sky, and whatever chose to enter it. The B-7 carried 10 men, each sealed into his own compartment. Pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, navigator and bombardier in the nose, flight engineer above them, radio operator behind the bomb bay, 2 waist gunners standing at open windows, where freezing air cut through gloves and jackets, a ball turret gunner hanging beneath the aircraft in a glass sphere that felt like a coffin even on calm days, and Moran alone, guarding the bomber's most vulnerable approach. The tail gunner's job was brutally simple: protect the rear. German pilots learned early that a direct approach from behind placed them under the fire of only one man. If that man hesitated, froze, or was wounded, the bomber did not limp home. It died. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force was paying an almost unbearable price. Deep missions carried losses crews learned not to calculate too closely. Briefings avoided statistics, but fear found its way into every silence. Bomber crews called deep missions into Germany milk runs to hell. The mathematics of survival were brutal. A bomber crew needed to complete a long sequence of missions before earning the right to go home. Many never reached that point. Some groups lost aircraft faster than replacements arrived. Every takeoff carried an unspoken countdown that no one dared to say aloud. Moran had enlisted as soon as he was old enough. He grew up on a dairy farm near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, where responsibility came early and excuses were not an option. The Army Air Forces needed gunners with steady hands and controlled nerves. Farm boys fit that requirement well. Training taught Moran to track fast-moving targets, to fire in controlled bursts, to recognize enemy aircraft instantly. Those lessons mattered on paper. In combat, they mattered only if fear could be held in check. Training could not prepare anyone for combat at altitude. Cold stole strength. Oxygen thinned thought. Every movement became deliberate, and when fighters arrived, they came with discipline, not emotion, attacking in patterns refined through experience. Wreckage crossed the North Sea in tight formation with other bombers, each aircraft positioned to cover the others. The theory was simple: overlapping fire would discourage attackers. The reality was unforgiving. As the formation approached Bremen, anti-aircraft fire erupted. Dark bursts filled the sky. The bombers could not maneuver. They had to fly straight and level for the bomb run. Accuracy demanded predictability. Predictability invited punishment. Moran watched a bomber ahead take a direct hit and fold away beneath the formation. There was no time to react, no time to grieve. The bombers held course. Wreckage released its bombs. Mission accomplished. Now came the part no briefing could make routine, the flight home. If you want to see how Moran's mission turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Moran. As the formation turned away from the target, hostile airspace still stretched ahead. That was when flak struck Rikki Tikitabi's No. 2 engine. Power drained away. The bomber began to lag behind the others. A damaged bomber falling behind the formation was not unlucky. It was marked. Enemy pilots watched for that moment. Moran saw them coming. As the protective grid of overlapping fire drifted forward, a widening gap opened behind the formation. Experienced German pilots did not rush. They circled patiently, testing angles, waiting for gravity and timing to work in their favor. The first attack came from low and directly behind. Moran pressed into the steel chest plate and brought his guns up smoothly. When the fighter crossed into range, he fired. Tracer rounds cut through the air. The attacker broke away. Another replaced it almost immediately. There was no pause, no relief. The attacks came in waves. Fighters worked in pairs, forcing Moran to commit his fire, then slipping toward blind spots. Spent brass piled around his boots. Cordite filled the tail compartment. The guns grew hot beneath his hands, while the rest of his body fought the cold. Then the hits began to land. Somewhere forward, a gun went silent, then another. The intercom dissolved into broken fragments of sound. Moran could no longer tell who was still alive. He kept firing. Cannon fire tore into the tail section. Pain flared through both arms. Blood soaked his sleeves. His fingers still moved. His hands still closed on the triggers, so he kept firing. Between bursts, Moran glanced down at the parachute strapped to his chest. Jagged holes tore through the silk canopy. It was useless. Another impact shuddered through the aircraft. Rikki Tikitabi was breaking apart. The fuselage failed forward of the tail. Moran watched the front of the bomber separate and fall away, carrying wings, engines, cockpit, and crewmates into the haze below. Eugene Moran had perhaps 90 seconds to live. There was a moment, a single breath, where nothing happened. 1 second of silence, then he did something that defied logic. He kept fighting. The fighters circled the falling wreckage, uncertain. Moran dragged the guns back toward the opening as the tail section tumbled. G-forces slammed him into metal. The ground rushed closer, and still he fired. Not because it would save him, because stopping was never an option. If you are still here, stay with this story. What comes next explains why endurance, not drama, decides who lives. The fall slowed as damaged stabilizers caught air. Not enough to make it safe. Enough to change the outcome. The tail section struck the top of a pine tree, tore through branches, and slammed into frozen ground. Silence followed. He had survived a 4-mile fall without a parachute. German soldiers arrived. They searched him, examined the wreckage, and left him in the snow. An officer looked once and turned away. The American was dying. He was moved without treatment. Infection followed. Fever came hard. Survival narrowed to endurance alone. 2 doctors made a different decision. They would try to save him. The operation lasted hours. Tools were crude, relief minimal. Survival would not be decided by medicine but by time. The fever broke. Moran lived. What followed was captivity layered upon exhaustion. Transport without comfort, hunger without relief, movement without destination. He endured cattle cars, then the hold of a freighter so dark and foul that time itself seemed to dissolve. The hell ship. Men stood packed together, air gone stale, bodies failing in silence. Survival became the simple act of continuing to breathe. Later came forced marches across frozen roads, guards impatient, bodies collapsing. The march would later become known as the Black March. Men fell, guards fired. Survival narrowed to placing 1 foot ahead of the other, 2 aggressive costs. If stories like this matter, take a moment to stay engaged. These are not tales of spectacle but of consequence. On April 26, 1945, the march ended. Liberation arrived quietly. Weight lost. Strength gone. Life preserved. Eugene Moran returned home carrying wounds that never fully healed. He raised a family. He worked his land. He lived with pain and memory, not for recognition, but because life continued. Eugene Moran died on March 23, 2014. If this story stayed with you, pause for a moment and reflect. Which part of his story stayed with you?